Audio.
Hello,
Hi,
everybody.
Pradeep.
This is
Were you having a problem
Hello,
connecting, Pradeep?
everybody. This is Pradeep from Sydney.
We all know you.
So good to see all of you, and a very good afternoon from Sydney. There is a lovely afternoon, sunny outside. There is a cricket match going on in Melbourne, and I know yesterday it was quite a balanced play. I don't know what is the score today, but let's look at the scores at this session. So,
So,
ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you to this session of Global Engagement Day of IIT Delhi Alumni Association. We have been living in some interesting times for the last 12 months, which look forward to continuing and which nobody knows which way the world will pan out. So we are very much in unpredictable times with low probability, high impact events. So, what will be the scenarios in 2021 when the economy, when our life will be driven by health, by corona, by COVID, by whatever name you may call it. And we've got together a lovely set of leaders. Let me start in alphabetical order. The first and foremost is Arun Dugal. He is a chairman and director of number of companies, including ITC, Mango Refineries, and a couple of other ones. Comes with a very strong background in banking and financial services, having been the country head for Bank of America, as well as having spent time, a significant amount of time in New York. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a round of applause to Arun. And Arun, if you can raise your hand and say hi to everybody. Next, let me try and remember alphabetically who comes in next. Oh man, from A, let's go to P. And we have Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor, who is a batchmate of mine who joined IFS, who even IIT Days was very clear that he wants to join the IFS. And has a very, very interesting career, has been ambassador in a number of countries, is an adjunct professor at number of places in the US. He lives in the US and elsewhere in the world. He's also a board advisor. But more importantly, why I have him here today is because he's recently written a book which has become a bestseller on Amazon. And that has got very strong bearings on what we are discussing today as to what are this economic, let me kind of put it, not economic, but what are the health scenarios in the first place, and how are they going to drive the economic scenarios, and how is that going to drive our own lives, the way we live, learn, work, socialize, and so on and so forth. So please give a round of applause to Pradeep. And Pradeep, if you can raise your hand, that will be fabulous.
thank you, Pradeep.
Well, that is excellent. That is the Corona way. And also remembering back our roots, Namaskar.
Namaste.
So, moving on to from A, which is sitting in Bangalore at the moment, to P, who's sitting in Maryland at the moment, and we go to R. And we go to Rakesh in the US.
You mean?
Rakesh is also a batchmate of mine. And I was just calculating, he is the chairman of a couple of companies in the US. And I was just calculating that this man oversees something like $60 million a day. Man, can I get even 1% of that? Rakesh. So, because he is the chairman of, I think four companies which equivalently do somewhere around 18, $19 billion. I actually had trouble in fitting all those zeros in my calculator, but it doesn't matter. Rakesh please remember, I was a very good friend of yours during IIT days, and you should remember that fondly.
You're still a good
Hey,
friend.
please give a round of applause to Rakesh. And Rakesh, if you can raise your hand. Fabulous. So we have three people, Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor, Rakesh, and myself, who are from 77 batch. But let that not cloud our memories. We've got some another very distinguished gentleman, and he is Raj, जिसको हम प्यार से राज बुलाते हैं. He is from Ohio, and he's been a very senior figure in both academia as well as industry. Raj has been a very eminent academician in both business and finance, has been dean, and he is a visiting professor in practically so many universities, including Harvard and I don't know where all. So I don't want to spend the whole 40 minutes just describing what he does. He's also on, advisory, not advisory board, he's on the boards of number of entities. So please give a round of applause to Raj. And Raj, if you can raise your hand.
Right here.
Let me kickstart the
Happy to be here.
discussion by kind of highlighting what is the baseline. We've had a very uncertain year 2020 as we head towards 2021. In a simplistic model, the health is driving, the economy is driving us. And from a health perspective, you can have a scenario, three scenarios just to kickstart the discussion, which is that the COVID is, contained very well. COVID is not contained very well, and somewhere in between to put down high, medium, low in terms of health. Likewise, the economic impact can be put down that we will recover very quickly. That is the often talked about V-shaped recovery. Or is it going to be quite prolonged, or is it going to be somewhere in between, and we have a high, medium, low factors over there. Of course, you've got associated issues like while you may have economic recovery, but does it also leave in terms of continuous or job growth? That's another factor. But let me kickstart the discussion by first asking Pradeep Kapoor, who has written the recent book about the future post COVID. What do you see as the health scenarios panning out in US where you live, in India, which is your home country, in China, which is a bad word at the moment, and the rest of the world? So over to you, Pradeep.
Thank you, Pradeep. Such a pleasure to be here and also to see Ravinder Kumar here, the president of the IITD Alumni Association. And congratulations to the IIT Delhi and to GCC and to Pradeep Khanna particularly for organizing this very important discussion during these 3 days of festivities and festival. So happy season's greetings, happy holidays to everybody, and good to be awake at past midnight in the US in Washington DC. So for the question which you have asked about the health scenarios, we have discussed this in the book which is called Beyond COVID-19, Envisioning a Better World by Transforming the Future of Healthcare. So it's going to be a mixed bag in 2021 also. We have seen that the world has learned very little in terms of where it was in 1918 when the Spanish plague broke out and millions of people died all over the world, about 50 million deaths, and many hundred millions were affected, including in India. So the scenario is the same, and whether we learn from this pandemic and learn how to cope with such pandemics in the future, because the future 2021 and beyond is not a question of if another pandemic will happen. It's only a question of when another pandemic will happen now. And the frequency may not be 100 years. The frequency may be much more often. So the only thing that we have been better at many things in terms of the healthcare delivery, etc. Overall, there have been too many changes and improvements. The speed of the vaccine, for example, the monitoring, the record keeping. But in terms of the responses of the individual and the governments, it has not been adequate or appropriate. Also, the governments have realized for the first time, or after a very long time, that there are certain issues which are beyond the capacity of any weapon or any government systems to cope with. So to try to cope with such issues in the future on their own, even if you are the most powerful country in the world like the US. I am here in the US and I see the utter state of confusion and chaos which has prevailed since day one. What would one have wished to see or loved to see is a more informed response, a more learned response, a more structured response, a more satisfactory response, where people could have been told that these are the learnings from the Spanish plague of 1918 and this is how we need to react and cope with this current pandemic and for future pandemics. So if you see the messaging which was happening at during the early part of the 20th century during the Spanish plague and the messaging now about masking, about social distancing, etc., there are so many similarities. So we have not moved very far in some ways and we have moved far in some ways. But are we adequately prepared for the future? I do not think so. We need a lot more to do to understand where we are and how to cope not only with natural disasters like pandemics but wars, bioweapon terrorism, etc., which will all be similar in scope and extent. Thank you, Pradeep.
Thank you very much, Pradeep. Looks like that you want us to buy your book.
Yes.
Really understand as to what those three scenarios are you've talked about. Just joking. Now, moving across to, I want to go to Rakesh. Rakesh, given the health kind of a thing and Pradeep's answer of, that we will be somewhere in between, that is, of course, very, very diplomatic answer, considering that he is anywhere diplomat. So I want to ask you, what are your perspectives on this? And what do you see as the economic impact of that? Do you see a rapid recovery? Do you see a very slow, certain sectors kind of be taking very, very long to recover? And how is that going to impact us? So over to you, Rakesh.
Thanks, Pradeep. And again, thanks for arranging this. I want to wish everybody happy holidays. This has been a very interesting year, to say the least, for everybody in this world, and hoping that 21 is going to be quite different. But listen, I think this whole containment of COVID is going to be spotty. It's going to be different around the globe. There's obviously vaccine has become available or is becoming available in the developed world as we speak, much more than that poorer countries will have to wait their turn to get it. But even having said that, places like the US, there's so much debate about whether people want to still have the vaccine. This is not like China where the government can mandate people taking the vaccine. So that's another issue that we have in countries like the US and frankly in many democracies, where people are still very suspicious about how fast this vaccine was developed, how effective this vaccine is, how safe it's going to be. I can tell you from being in the healthcare industry for many years here in the US, the work that's been done on the mRNA therapeutics has been going on for many years. So this is not something that people just dreamed of in the last 12 months. I'm fairly confident that this is going to be very effective and safe. even though it's been released only for emergency use. I think it's going to be very effective. Having said that, I think this did not start off as a financial crisis, as we all know. COVID started off as a different crisis, but it's morphing itself into becoming an economic crisis. For many countries in the world, this crisis has been softened by things like fiscal stimulus. So in the US, you've had fiscal stimulus. Interest rates are now near zero. In some countries, they're negative. So they have actually buffered a lot of impact of COVID. Now you should ask yourself, what happens if this containment takes much longer, which I think it's going to take longer than what most people think. And when the stimulus money runs out, when governments can't support the businesses and people that have been affected so much, what is the economic shock going to be? And I think so. For that reason, I don't see a V-shaped recovery. I think the recovery is going to be slower, but surely there's going to be recovery. I think we're on the right path. Countries like China are likely to see more like a V-shaped recovery. They've already, China had the benefit where they had the COVID happen first, they contained it first, and they became nearly normal first. So while all the other countries in the world were still struggling, the Chinese economy came back, and they were the people who had the ability to manufacture all the goods the world still needed. And so they are probably one place that's going to see a fairly rapid recovery, and they already have. And the other thing is the world has changed, right? You talk about the new normal. The recovery is not going to be even for every industries. I think we all know that some of the disruptions that have taken place are going to be permanent for many industries, right? I mean, the travel business is not going to be the same. On one hand, you're going to have air freight that's going to increase because of supply chains, but passenger traffic is going to be down. The whole world is becoming digital. I think one of the things that I've heard what people say is COVID is like the time machine. It has compressed time like nobody could ever imagine. What would take 10 years to decide in boardrooms and companies is happening now in months. And so time has become an incredible element that is going to stay with us for a long, long time. So that's one. And the other thing is this is definitely becoming a digital world. And so you're going to see a lot of recovery with companies that embrace both the time element and the digital world. And those who don't embrace it, their recoveries may never happen.
Fabulous, Rakesh. Some interesting points, but I'll pick you up on those later on. But let me go across to Arun. Arun, it is becoming obvious, and I think even without this panel discussion, it is obvious that it is going to be a mixed bag insofar as the health containment is concerned. And yes, the economic recovery is going to be uneven with certain sectors totally changed. And as per Rakesh, it is not going to be a V-shaped recovery. But when we look at the stock markets, everywhere in the world, stock markets are kind of roaring. And yes, we know that there are points in time when the stock markets are disconnected with the real economy, but this kind of a disconnect. And so are you kind of seeing that maybe we will have a correction and a serious correction in times ahead to come? What are your thoughts? This is to you, Arun. Arun, cannot hear you. So let's pass on this question to Raj. Raj has a bit.
Well, I think the recovery is not going to be V-shaped, that's for sure. I think it's going to be a little longer. And it will also depend on what part of the world we are talking about. The developed countries are likely to get the vaccine faster than the developing countries. So the recovery will be faster in the developed countries and slower in the developing countries. Now, in terms of, earlier in the thing you mentioned, what is the situation in the US and India? In India, I think we are a little bit fortunate that the spread of the virus has not been as rapid and as extensive as in the US. And some research is showing that this may be because all of us, when we were growing up, got the BCG vaccination against TB. And that seems to confer some protection against this virus. So that's a new piece of research that may explain what's happening in India. But nevertheless, the recovery in India will be slower because vaccination will be slower for a lot of different reasons, logistics involved and so forth. The stock market is not the economy. Stock market is forward looking, and so it's going to recover quite differently compared to the actual economy. And as other people have said before, and I would like to emphasize that quite a bit, that there'll be rapid increase in digitization of everything. And I think that's going to be accelerated undoubtedly. Now, for example, people are saying, is globalization dead? No, it isn't. It's just becoming digital. And I think large part of that can be explained that way. Supply chains are going to be wider, in other words, from more places than just China, and to reduce the risk, and they're going to be shorter. For example, the US companies may go to Mexico and other places in Latin America or Central America. And working from home is going to definitely have a step increase compared to pre-pandemic days. That has a lot of implications. When you start working from home, it also means that home could be in India. So there'll be huge increase in outsourcing of increasing in number of white collar workers in the US. And that'll exacerbate the unemployment problem and the economic recovery problem. So I think I see a lot of major changes in business happening after this pandemic, changes that may have taken decades or at least years before this pandemic happened. An interesting side note is that, whether we learned anything from the 1918 pandemic, I've been thinking about that. Well, the trouble is that while we may have learned something from the 1918 pandemic, and we probably forgot most of it since it's been 100 years since that happened, and it's hard to remember lessons for 100 years, let alone 5-10 years. And then on top of that, I think the people have not changed. People will not change. People are going to be the same. The trouble with the pandemic in 1918 was people did not heed what the authorities were saying. Not everybody did. Trouble with the pandemic now, people did not heed what the authorities are saying and what the science is telling them. So I think people are going to be who they are. They're not going to change very much. And so the effectiveness of these measures to contain a pandemic are going to be very good in totalitarian states like China. And so when you have a democracy, the downside of that is that people are independent. They're going to do what they want to a large extent. And not all of us believe in science, believe in the social good. And so a lot of people are not going to be socially responsible. It's just natural. So I think that we'll have a pretty decent recovery from the pandemic, not fast, but pretty decent. I expect the economy to well on its way to recovery by the end of 21 in the US and other developed countries. And I think the penetration of the vaccines in the US should be pretty good by about the middle of 2021. So I think a lot of businesses that have closed, like retail and restaurants and so forth, will start recovering because of the vaccinations. Does that address your question?
Yeah, it does. And the perspective that I'm getting up to now is that yes, health is going to be a mixed bag. Yes, it is not going to be a V-shaped recovery. Yes, the stock market is a forward indicator. Okay, but let me switch tack and let me go to Pradeep Kapoor. There are political dimensions, with Biden, coming in as president-elect. Now, what do you see that will that have a, what kind of, obviously he's going to be, more proactive, he'll want to do something, but what do you see? Do you see a very rapid acceleration and the scenario that you described Do you think that's going to have a much bigger impact because Biden is going to be there as the president? And consequently, what do you see as the economic impact? This is for you, Pradeep Kapoor.
Thank you, Pradeep. And that's going to be an important dynamic for the world. The geopolitics of the world has already changed very significantly under the Trump administration. And the strategic community here in the US and the political community, in the sense of the parliamentarians, the congressmen, the senators, and the administration, the White House, etc., the National Security Administration, NSA, etc., National Security Advisor, and the others, are quite, sort of clear in their minds, and there's a consensus here that China is threat number one, and that India is a very high priority, if not the top priority, for the future going ahead amongst all these communities. So for the Biden administration, in spite of the fact that a lot of stories will keep on emerging about Hunter Biden's doings in China and the money that he got from there and the boards that he's sitting on in Chinese companies, etc., it's not going to be easy for the father, Joe Biden, to have a soft approach towards China. He may try to distract by picking on Russia, for example, or by focusing on some other issues which are global terrorism, etc., to dilute the focus on China in the future going ahead in 2021 onwards. But the strategic community and the others are going to be watching, including the academic community in the US, which has been writing a lot about this threat, because China has sort of managed to influence a lot of the narrative in the US. We are hearing every day about how the universities in the US have been co-opted by Chinese funds, how the media in the US has been co-opted by Chinese funds, including well-known universities and media, including the Harvard, MIT, and Columbia University last, Yale earlier. So the iconic brand names of USA, the Ivy League also. In the newspapers, we have heard about funds being given to Washington Post, New York Times, and others. So if there has been all this dynamic, Trump was taking a stand which was like quite firm about these aspects for whatever reasons. Trade has already been impacted very significantly. So if we talk about the strategic aspects, yes, it will focus a lot on disrupting the supply chain. So I don't think the economic recovery in China is going to be as fast as some of my friends here on the panel think. Because if the world is turning away from you in so many ways, if the supply chains are moving out of China, if there is a global consensus economically, not consensus, but quite a sort of a build-up of opinion against China because of the virus and because of other reasons, their flexing of arms. No country in the world, in the history of the world, has ever succeeded by opening up so many fronts as China has. And just for our listeners from the IIT community, I would like to list out some of those very quickly. You have the South China Seas, where they have massively antagonistic, tensions with all their neighbors practically over claims of islands and territories. Then you have the Hong Kong issue. In the South China Seas and East China Seas, you are facing off against the most powerful navy in the world, the US Navy, almost on a weekly or daily basis now. You have internal problems in Xinjiang, which are very, very serious, which the world is focusing more and more attention. In Tibet, in Ladakh, you have taken on a very powerful enemy, which is a very confident country like India. So you have opened up so many fronts there. And on the BRI, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative, which was one of their major initiatives, which before COVID seemed like it may go in a sort of a mixed way. After COVID, there's a bigger question mark on this, with India and US opposing it quite emphatically now. So what I see is, and plus their focus on how they have influenced the World Health Organization in terms of not declaring this as a pandemic, etc., etc. So I don't see a positive response from most countries of the world. The Quad is building up its strength. The Quad is the US, India, Australia, and Japan. Many more countries are joining in as observers. They may join in as members. This is basically a military alliance already. So, militarily, strategically, geopolitically, economically, I see tremendous tectonic shifts taking place over 2021, 2022, where the US India partnership will become more and more important. It will become ultimately the defining partnership for the world for the 22nd century and beyond. So I would 21st century also, it's still a long way to go. I would not agree with the views that it's going to be, a quick recovery. The impact is already there. The things are bottomed out a lot. So even
So,
in the
Pradeep,
US,
in other
yeah,
words, what I hear is that the big elephant in the room is China, insofar as 2021 scenarios are concerned. That's number one. Number two is that I love when different panelists disagree because that's where the fun begins. Okay, so let me now go across to Arun. Arun has come back, and Arun, is this the new normal that we keep having dropouts and again kind of join back and all that kind of stuff? But jokes apart, what are the organizations going to do, or are they going to do in 2021? Are they going to invest? Are they going to divest? Or are they going to rationalize? What do you think is happening in the corporate environment? And what are your boards telling you?
Thank you, Pradeep. Thank you for having me on the panel. And I apologize. The connectivity where I am is not so great, but I'm glad to be back and I heard part of the discussion. I will focus my comments on something I know a little bit, which is what's happening in the business and industry and economy in India. I think the best case scenario is what the stock market is already underwritten. Stock market is at its highest. Interest rates are low, and the numbers of new infections, the hospitalization, and deaths, all of them are in the positive territory. So there is a assumption here that the best case that you described earlier is sort of unfolding in India. And it is very possible, in my view, that we would see an unprecedented economic growth in 2021. The GDP growth could be as high as 15%, like it happened in China last year, once the recovery there started. But at the same time, with that kind of growth, we will see real estate sector really taking off. With so much cheap money having been made available, the inflation is likely to make a comeback. And my view is that by end of the year 2021, we might have a 6% or so inflation, and interest rates of RBI will have to raise interest rate to that level. So that's the best case scenario that I believe and I hope would unfold. The stock market is already sort of betting on it. But the other pessimistic scenario, I will just say, if that happens, if COVID or new strain continues to spread, then 2021 unfortunately will be similar to 2020. And if things are in between, then I think we could have a economic growth of 6-8%, and thereafter the economy will take off. You mentioned about whether people are looking to invest a lot of money and so on. It's a mixed bag. Some industries, they are just trying to make sure that they survive, and they've been conserving cash. The banks have been very, very reluctant to lend, and their NPA levels are very high. So I don't think people are as yet ready to invest or take on new projects. There is some M&A activity happening, but that's in the distress space, not in the growth space. So
Fabulous.
in summary,
Love it. Love it. So one end we are forecasting. See what we are. The key message is depends on which part of the world you're looking at. And in some parts of the world, we could be having high growth, high inflation kind of environments. In other parts of the world, we still have a very not V shape, but whatever, whether it is W or U or whatever it is, that's going to pan out. Okay. Now there is one aspect which is happening, is that the personal balance sheets of people are getting strengthened in the COVID era. And the reason for that is that in most of the developed economies, the governments are kind of, handing out money. The expenses are being cut down, discretionary expenses. What do you see the impact of a strengthened personal balance sheet on economy? I mean, I'm seeing this very in Australia. There is estimated to be roughly about 20 billion, which has got saved up in the last this thing, which is just waiting to be spent. So, Raj, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the personal balance sheets of the US are split. We are a country that is increasing in economic inequality, and the top 30% are doing wonderfully well, and the top 5% are doing really incredibly well. But if you look at the bottom 50% of the US population, a recent survey by the Federal Reserve, this is pre-pandemic, indicated that they would have difficulty coming up with $400 in emergency funds. So balance sheets of the bottom 50% are very thin. There's no room in it, and people are having to go to charitable food banks and food pantries to get their food. They don't have money to buy food, and a lot of them are going to be evicted if this recent bill doesn't pass because they don't have money to pay rent. So I really think the economic recovery will depend a great deal on how this bottom 50% of the Americans do, because their spending is what is going to generate demand for businesses. And I think that is a very significant issue. And the new administration will likely pay a lot of attention to that, and they will try to convey resources to the bottom 50% as much as they can. Not only is it ideologically consistent with their views, it is also an economic necessity, in my opinion. So
thank you very much. You made some beautiful points, because I think there is no other country where there is so much of a dichotomy between the haves and the have-nots kind of a thing as US. So it's a very, very different picture altogether. Now we've got precisely 3 minutes left. Now I want to, have two comments of 1.5 minutes each. And one is that I hear that Ravi wants to talk about reconfiguration of the global supply chains. And the other question that I have, and this is for Rakesh, but I'll come to Rakesh. So Ravi, you have 1 minute and 20 seconds.
Yeah. Thank you, Pradeep. And all the panelists. One of the theme which we have thought of about the global chapter is global supply value chain. If you see that there are three things which are in a global supply chain system. I'm talking about from the Indian perspective and how in the global market. The India that we need to reduce the cost of production and improve the logistic. That is the one paradigm. The second thing, when there is a global supply chain, there is a flow of technology transfer, and with the flow of when there is a technology transfer happens and the innovation are come, then the issues of protection of intellectual properties, that is another interlinked issue. And the third point, which is most important as far as India is concerned in global value supply chain, that we have to produce the complex products of global standards, because India is perceived as a very low as far as the global supply chain. We are at the lower end of the global supply chain. So this is this thing. And I would like to just add that we are the pharma capital. There are 10 industries have been identified by the government of India by product link incentive. There, and these are all, I'll just read out the name if my time permits. These are 10
Ravi,
industries.
in the
One is
interest of
pharma.
time, I have to pass on to Rakesh,
Okay,
and
thank
we
you.
will take the list of names from you in the chat session.
Yeah,
So-
thank you. Thank you, Pradeep. Yeah, thank you.
So Rakesh, my last question, and you have 1 minute to answer, is that we have seen very rapid development. And I'm asking you this question because you have spent a lot of time in the health industry. A number of companies that you've been leading are from the health and pharma sector. So this rapid development of vaccine, is that going to be the new norm?
Absolutely. I think this is one of the dimensions that has changed is not only have pharma companies accelerated their efforts to developing not just vaccines, I think you're going to see the same technology that Moderna and Pfizer have used, the mRNA technology, that's also going to apply on therapeutics for cancer and other things. And what the other interesting thing that's happened is it has forced government bodies like the FDA to think about approvals in a different way as well. So I think with the focus that biopharma and pharma companies have and the ability for regulatory bodies to think about approvals in a different way, what used to take 10 years, I think is going to take probably a year or two now. So I think that is very, very encouraging for mankind all over. And it's not just vaccines. There's a lot of interesting work that's going on outside of COVID, which, these days we can't think about because we only think about COVID. But there are many, many diseases, which hopefully will be solved in the coming few years using these new technologies.
Thank you very much. It was a very, very interesting discussion. I felt very stimulated after this. And what it tells me is that we must carry forward the discussion and maybe have another session after a month or 2 months or maybe 3 months also and see what we are forecasting and how are we tracking on that. And in summary, what it really appears is that, that when we talk about, there is no one holistic kind of a scenario. It depends on which part of the world you're looking at. And, and China is, of course, the big elephant in the room. And yes, we are going to see some parts having, high growth, high inflation, and other parts, it's going to be kind of, much, much wider distributed. If that be the case, I will say, have a good morning, afternoon, evening, night, whatever it is in your part of the world. Enjoy your evening, either a cup of tea or a glass of wine. And I look forward to catching up with all of you and carrying forward the discussion. Thank you very much. And bye for now
Thank you.
from Sydney.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing it,
Bye.
and hope we stay in touch, all of us.
Absolutely. I'll make sure that we have a follow-through session and we keep in touch.
Thanks.
Thank you
Happy
very much.
holidays to everybody.
Yeah, thank you. And I request that you watch, today's session also and tomorrow's session also. And I request on behalf of IIT Delhi Alumni Association, we have 54,000 strong alumni spread across the globe. And we have, have a lot of sessions, and Pradeep is like today he's looking after the global day. Then we have tomorrow also. We have a lot, and there are a lot of sessions where we have an entertainment in the evening. In the morning 8 o'clock, we have started global chess tournament also. Morning 8 o'clock, Indian time, we already started. So we have, back to back lot of events. So thanks for coming, and I look forward that you see other programs and give your opinion and more importantly, tell us how to do better the next time, because this was the pandemic time.
Absolutely will.
So
We
that's
tell
we are
you
looking
how to
forward
do
to
better in
comments,
health.
suggestion. Thank you.